Well, I'm really pleased to have with me once again Daniel McAdams, who heads up the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. I don't think I need to provide any further information about Daniel because he's been such a regular guest on this show. So welcome, Daniel. It's really good to have you with me again.
Thanks so much for having me back, Jay. It's great to be with you.
Really good to have you with me. And there is an article that I spotted today on the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity website by Ron Paul that's titled National Endowment for Democracy, ? Subtitle, The U.S. Democracy Promotion Destroys Democracy Overseas. Destroys democracy overseas, Daniel. And I always thought that we fought a world war, I believe it was the First World War, that was supposed to make the world safe for democracy. What am I missing here?
Well, the whole idea conceptually, if you think about it, of the U.S. government taking our tax dollars, going overseas and financing a bunch of political NGOs that have their own agendas and that are sometimes or oftentimes tied to political parties and movements, and providing them with the resources to dominate, in some cases, the political marketplace. It's actually a distortion of democracy. I mean, we think of democracy as kind of an organic, component of society. It's a process rather than an outcome necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So when you do, just like with intervening in the economy, when you come in and alter the processes, the outcome has been distorted as well.
Mm-hmm.
So just conceptually, it's anti-democratic for a government to give money to a political party overseas because it gives them an advantage, an unfair advantage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But that's what we're doing with our non-government organizations.
Sure,
NGOs.
we've been doing it since we've been doing it for forever, really. But the National Endowment for Democracy was unfortunately founded in the Reagan administration, and it was a pet project of all of the Scoop Jackson liberals, who went to the Republican Party en masse when they felt that the Democratic Party was just being a little too anti-war. So they all jumped ship to the Republicans, and this is one of the things they extracted from Reagan. One of the promises they extracted from Reagan in exchange for their support for his presidency. And so they've played this. The same people who founded it are still in charge of it. They've upped their activities, and you would have thought at the end of the Cold War, even if you thought they had some place in the Cold War, you would have thought at the end of the Cold War that they would have closed up shop. But the opposite has been the case. They've redoubled their efforts.
Yeah, well, that's not what most Americans think. It seems to be the mainstream media has our whole involvement in the Ukraine, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about mostly about today, Daniel, or have you talk to us, I should say, not me talk to you. The Ukraine, it seems to me that the popular press that we have here, the mainstream press, is making Putin the bad guy, and we are the saviors. We're the wonderful people over there that are helping people set up a democracy. Well, what I don't understand is how do Americans miss the fact that a popular or an elected official was just recently booted out? Americans don't seem to think that we had anything to do with that, right? I mean, there seems to be, this notion that going back to John Perkins, who's been on the show a number of times, back in the 1950s when our CIA unseated an elected government, causing all kinds of problems, and stirred up the population, and they threw out the elected official. What evidence do we have, Daniel, that these NGOs are really responsible for unseating the elected of Yanukovych in the Ukraine?
Sure. Well, one of the things that we do know is the U.S. government's involvement as such. We have the famous intercepted phone call between Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and the U.S. Ambassador to Kiev, where they discussed in great detail how the government should be overthrown and who should come to power. And it's indeed come to pass as they had planned it. So we know that. But we also, this same Victoria Nuland had delivered a speech just this past December in which she outlined the fact that the U.S. over the past, 20 years had spent some $5 billion to promote and develop democracy in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And much of this U.S. government funding is funneled through the NGOs, through the National Endowment for Democracy and its sub-grantees. And there's one on the Republican side, the International Republican Institute, and on the Democrat side, the National Democratic Institute. And to make it even further complex, you have the unions, the AFL-CIO, has their own NGO that is funded that goes over there and does things. And that's, I mean, problematic twofold. You know, the forced propagandization toward unionization overseas with U.S. taxpayer money is obviously problematic. But you also have another thing that's quite interesting. When you have U.S. government-funded and controlled unions overseas, you can turn on and off a strike at any time. And if you look back over the history of these so-called color revolutions, you'll often find that that there'll be a very strategically placed strike here or there or the other, and it just helps foment the chaos. So that's just another one of the tentacles of the U.S. funded NGOs.
Yeah. So the National Endowment for Democracy is over there stirring things up with these other NGOs that you mentioned as well. I mean, it's really striking, Daniel, when I think about it. We have a labor organization here that are trying to organize and get rid of or put in labor unions in other countries. I mean, this is incredible, and it seems to me almost a reversal of the Cold War in the sense that a reversal of the bad guys in the Cold War, in the sense that the Soviets were trying to implant socialism or communism in other countries. And what are we doing? We're going over there. You're saying the National Endowment for Democracy. How could we question something with a name like that? It must be for the good. And all these other names that you mentioned sound like it. They all must be for the good. And yet, what you're saying is something that's the furthest from the belief system in America, that these organizations are actually doing harm. They are overturning the will of the people, in essence, trying to stir things up and create chaos, I guess, so that the order can be overthrown. And then what?
Sure. Well, it's like, I mean, the thing is, you think about it in terms of domestic as well. You know, everything the government tells you about any of its programs, you believe the opposite. You know, when Obama comes out and tells you how this wonderful, glorious Obamacare is going to save us all, you know, everyone knows to believe the opposite, you know, increasingly. So anything the government tells you about any of its programs, you can usually believe the opposite. And that certainly is true with these organizations overseas. And what's troubling in recent years, I think, is that these NGOs that are funded by the U.S. government who operate overseas are no longer holding these kind of pointy-headed, these kind of pointy-headed seminars where they talk about the glories of voting or something, but they've actually shifted to be more operational, and they're handing out devices that are made. The U.S. government, in partnership with some U.S. corporations, are developing different kinds of communication devices for people who are coordinating an overthrow on the street. I saw an article a few days ago talking about all the wonderful gadgets that have been made available to the people on the streets in Ukraine by the U.S. government to help them get around the authorities, coordinate their actions, coordinate their attacks, and this sort of thing. So it really has moved into an operational phase, and I have personally seen some evidence, but not enough that I'm comfortable saying without equivocation that there's some evidence of some paramilitary training as well. So, you know, they've clearly entered a new phase, I think, when it comes to these overthrows.
There certainly would be plenty of support for paramilitary action, I would imagine, starting with the likes of Senator McCain and others. You know, it seems to me, Daniel, that what we're doing, and this is why I think this program and the website, Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, is so important, because it is really the opposite of what people believe. It is really completely opposite, and it seems to me that if what you're saying is correct, that these NGOs are going in and actually unseating democratically elected governments, that we as a country are acting 180 degrees opposite the United States Constitution. We were supposed to be the notion that we are created with certain inalienable rights life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government wasn't supposed to get in the way of that, seems to me exactly 100% different than what we're doing is 100% off track. So
Yeah.
it seems to me, Daniel, that what we're talking about is so much of what Eisenhower warned about, the military-industrial complex. I suppose that's a big phrase, a big name to catch everything. But do you think? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Is this a military-industrial complex? What's going on here?
Well, I think it's always a convergence of interests, and I think everyone likes to think it's the one particular thing they're closest to or most interested in. Maybe it's a war for oil, maybe it's for the military-industrial complex, maybe it's for corporations, and I think there's a bit of it for everyone. I think that's how you have these actions take place when you have a lot of different interests that somehow come together. You also have the so-called liberal humanitarian interventionists who love to go help the downtrodden people and then end up leaving things worse than when they came. For example, Libya is a good example of that. And you have the neocons who believe that we need to change the world at the barrel of a gun.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you have a lot of different interests, and I think you can discuss them all individually or together either way. But you talk about democratic values and pushing democracy overseas. There was a great article recently by David Hendrickson. I believe he's at the Army War College, but it was published in the National Interest, and it's called "The Democratic Values at Stake in Ukraine." And he makes such an excellent point, which is that it's deeply illegitimate to have a revolution in a government that has been elected democratically.
Yeah.
And the whole essence of democracy is a peaceful change of power through the ballot box. And the U.S. used to recognize this.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to have a revolution. For example, the American Revolution, where there was not a popularly elected government,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone likes to think we're reliving either 1776 or 1989. But don't forget, both of those were revolts against governments that had not been popularly elected.
Right.
So this is actually a deformation of the concept of democracy,
Mm-hmm.
where you are hailing what is deeply illegitimate if you actually believe that the democracy is what we should be pushing, or that democracy is a good thing.
Right.
So
Or some sort of representative government of the people. Actually, our Constitution never used the word democracy. It was to be a republic.
Exactly.
But it was
and
to be.
I don't love that word, but I use it because the U.S. government is endlessly talking about it and using that word as if it's some sort of a religion.
Yeah.
But I encourage, if you're interested, or your listeners, to have a look at this David Hendrickson. It's a very good article about sort of where did we go wrong in our beliefs and understanding about what democracy and what, as you say, popularly elected government really is.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it certainly doesn't seem as though we respect the rights of people to choose. I think it was Hillary Clinton that recently talked about, maybe a couple of years ago when things were going on in North Africa, about we want them to have a democracy, but our kind of democracy, I think is the way she put it. And I'm thinking Chile, during the Nixon era, we supposedly our CIA unseated an elected government there. The first one, as John Perkins has pointed out, and after the Second War was in the 1950s, when we unseated an elected government in Iran. I'm wondering about a lot of these revolutions that occurred in North Africa in recent years. Daniel, what are your thoughts there? Were the NGOs involved in some of those as well?
You're talking about the so-called Arab Spring?
Exactly.
Yeah, that certainly hasn't worked out very well, has it? I was looking on the internet before we spoke, and I see that Egypt, the post-coup Egypt government, the ones who also overthrew a democratically elected government, like it or not, like the Morsi government or not, that's not really the point. But the generals who overthrew them have now held a trial, and they've sentenced the first group of pro-Morsi demonstrators to death, 500 of them. 16 were acquitted, so and there'll be, I guess, another 700 that will be put on trial soon. Of course, the U.S. says nothing about that at all.
No, well, it's just fine.
But in the Arab Spring, much of it was instigated by the U.S. government through things like the April 6th movement and various democratic pro-democracy organizations that the U.S. State Department set up and sponsored.
Yeah,
So,
allegedly pro-democratic.
exactly. Well, what happened in Egypt is a lot of the liberals were co-opted. They were brought to the U.S. They were given all this training in democracy and everything. They went back home and helped foment a revolution, which once it succeeded, they were tossed aside and ignored. There is a danger. People will say that this sounds like conspiracy thinking, that, oh, it's all the U.S. doing all of these things. Well, it's not necessary to control it 100% by the U.S. You have a situation where there already is unrest, there already is unhappiness. Certainly, when it comes to Ukraine and Egypt and these other places, there are people with legitimate beefs. There are people with legitimate gripes.
Sure.
And initially in Ukraine, you had a lot of, if you remember in the very beginning, a lot of young, good-looking kids waving their EU flags and their EU banners, and almost it was like a carnival atmosphere. So you had to have some of that discontent, but it wasn't very long before you saw these thugs with bats and iron bars and Molotov cocktails. So the trick is, and I'm sure there are plenty of psychologists employed by the U.S. government to figure these things out, but the trick is to channel that discontent and to focus it in a way that serves U.S. policy goals.
Yeah. Well, it was getting back to the Ukraine now. There was about 10 years ago, Congressman Paul warned exactly about the U.S. government funding NGOs for its activities in the Ukraine, and specifically he was warning about millions of dollars that the U.S. Congress was going to award an organization that you just talked about, the National Endowment for Democracy. And now, I mean, Ron is pointing out that clearly there are people, warmongers like Senator McCain and a host of other neocons that really want us to get, the bloodthirsty people that want us to get involved in, I guess, get involved in a shooting war in the Ukraine, right?
Well, McCain and saw over the weekend Charles Krauthammer and all of the usual neocons. What they want is they want the U.S. to bring Ukraine into NATO immediately, start providing arms to the Ukrainian government, and obviously that holds with it a real danger of ratcheting it up. Professor Stephen Cohen, who's been in the news quite a bit, he's a real Russia expert, and he was on Charlie Rose the other night, and he made a very, very good point, which is that we are 2 steps away from a hot war with Russia. The first step would be if we follow the advice of the neocons and start arming the so-called Ukrainian government. That would bring us, according to Professor Cohen, to a Cuban Missile Crisis level situation.
Wow.
And from there, it's one more step to a hot war with Russia. What's interesting about the Ukrainian military, and I've been watching this for a while, is that they are not at all. They appear to be not at all committed to this new government that took power by coup. It's interesting. The acting defense minister, who is a member of the Svoboda Party, which is the neo-fascist party. They put this guy in as defense minister. Well, he ordered the Ukrainian ships down by Crimea to start shooting at the Russians. And
they didn't.
Thankfully, they didn't. But there's even a press release on the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine's website where they say this. He says, what did he say? All the commanders received the order to fire, but they didn't follow it. So
interesting.
That's very interesting. Your commander tells you to fire and you don't.
Right. Well, I mean, Daniel, when you said, and the guy's name, I think he's a former banker that was put in place by who? By these NGOs? By our government? Who put this guy in place after the democratically elected government was disposed?
Yeah, I think his party had something like 4% support.
4% support. So it's an illegitimate government. But it's an illegitimate government. So our NGOs put this former banker in place to head up. We fermented trouble, got rid of an elected government, put in this 4% guy, And no wonder, is it any wonder that the military isn't following his commands?
Yeah, he wasn't just a banker. He was a failed banker, and he was a failed former finance minister.
Oh.
When he was in charge of the finance ministry before, he was an absolute disaster. But he is the guy who Victoria Nuland mentioned by name in her intercepted phone call. This is the guy we want as prime minister.
Mm.
So it was. I mean, I think it was direct from the top. And don't forget Victoria Nuland. I think we've discussed this before, Jay. She's married to Robert Kagan, who is an arch neocon. He's the co-founder of the Foreign Policy Initiative, which is an NGO that came out of the old Project for a New American Century.
Yeah.
And your listeners will remember that. That's the organization that helped lie us into the war with Iraq.
Uh-huh.
And of course, the neocons never go away when they're wrong. They just redouble their efforts.
Yeah.
But when that brand became so toxic, they had to change the name, and so they changed it to Foreign Policy Initiative, co-founded by Robert Kagan and William Crystal. And this organization employs, it must be extraordinarily well funded. It employs dozens and dozens of advisors and fellows and people like this. And some
Expensive
of them
people.
Sure, and some of them pose as journalists, and they'll attack. As a matter of fact, interestingly enough, the Ron Paul Institute was itself attacked pretty nastily last week by some of these people who are funded by the Foreign Policy Initiative, which is run by Victoria Nuland's husband, or founded at least by him. So they do have their tentacles in every aspect of the operational side and the propaganda side.
It would be nice if we could put a face to some of these organizations. Who are some of the people behind that are funding the National Endowment for Democracy and some of these other NGOs that you mentioned? George Soros' name has come up in some circles. Do you buy that?
Well, sure. I mean, if you look at how George Soros spends what are supposedly his millions and millions of dollars, who knows if they really are? Maybe they are. But they always serve the foreign policy goals of the United States government. So just that in and of itself is something suspicious. It's a kind of a privatized foreign policy.
Yeah.
What we've had recently, which is somewhat disturbing, is there have been other global corporations that have been involved. For example, Google was heavily involved in helping the Arab Spring, in helping finance some of the training of the Egyptians.
Yeah.
You had one of the founders of what is it? Was it eBay? Pierre Omidyar, who was found to have funded a lot of the activities in Ukraine. And even when Victoria Nuland gave this speech where she talked about the U.S. spending $5 billion to, quote, promote democracy, it's interesting that she was standing in front of the huge corporate logos. I believe it was Chevron and a few other huge corporations. So there certainly is a confluence of interest between the NGOs and increasingly the big corporations that are helping finance them. And they all seem to go absolutely in line with U.S. foreign policy goals.
All right, so we have U.S. foreign policy goals, which I would think we want to point out are not necessarily aligned with the good of the American people. And Ron Paul, in his article, National Endowment for Democracy, ? Points out that what we're doing in the Ukraine is certainly not in the interest of the American people. Could you perhaps make a couple of Ron's points for our listeners?
Sure. Well, one thing, if you look at recent polling in the U.S., Americans are not in favor of getting involved in Ukraine. They're not in favor of getting involved militarily, certainly. It's hardly in their interest to be hijacked by the U.S. government to spend $5 billion over there. All they get out of it is resentment among the people who are harmed. You think if any American thinks the Libyans love us right now, they need to have their head examined. All these places that are liberated, so-called liberated, they're absolute disasters. So, we're already bankrupt, and the new prime minister has already come to the U.S. with his hand out asking for more money, and they need billions and billions more.
This is the illegitimate guy you talked about, the 4% guy.
Yeah.
He's come to America asking the American taxpayers. What's that?
He was in town last week begging for some more money. They need something, at least $35 billion. And of course, there's a mistake in thinking that it's some poor Ukrainian lady, without any bread who's going to be helped.
Yeah.
Certainly we object to any foreign aid, even in that circumstance. But it's even far worse than that. This is money that'll go to pay off, international bankers who
Yes.
speculated on Ukrainian loans
Yes.
and other well-connected people. So it
Yes.
doesn't it's even worse than that. It doesn't help the Ukrainian people at all.
Yeah, it's a bank bailout. It's kind of a bank bailout, just like a small one, perhaps, compared to what we had after Lehman Brothers, but nonetheless another bank bailout. They look after the bankers, the corporate interest always, and this is supposed to be capitalism. I guess it's sold as capitalism.
Yeah,
It's
crony
fascism. It's
Yeah,
crony capitalism. I think a nastier name is fascism, which I think
yeah.
is really what we have, Daniel. What about the Ukrainian people then? Are they getting a big a bargain out of this if the United States coughs up another few $billions at taxpayers' expense? How are the Ukrainian people benefiting from this? Which is what we're being told. I mean, this is not for us. Oh no, no,
Yes.
we are loving, compassionate Americans who are over there killing all these bad guys for the sake of democracy. First, we unseat the democratically elected government, and then we go over there and install our own puppet, the
Yep.
4% guy, put him in power, and then we say, no, we have to fight Putin now because we are really caring for the Ukrainian people.
Well, I think
And so,
Americans.
so, so how is this going to help the Ukrainian people now?
Yeah, I would say I think Americans actually are very compassionate people, and I think people on their own voluntarily would be happy to provide money, their
hmm
own money voluntarily to an organization that actually would, buy bread for
Yes,
some
no
poor
doubt about it,
Ukrainian woman.
Daniel. No doubt.
Not at the barrel of a gun, but what they'll get out of it is these IMF guys descending on the country, who will saddle it up with tons and tons of debt
Yep.
that they'll never be able to repay.
hmm
Super sweetheart deals with foreign corporations who'll come in and strip the assets, and then the population will get their pensions cut in half and be told it's progress. Don't worry, you'll be seeing growth around the corner.
Right.
We'll ask the people of the Baltics and Poland about that growth. I mean, the only reason that the Baltics and Poland are not absolutely basket cases, they've exported half their population to the West. So
hmm
these are top-down pseudo solutions that never work. They don't have a track record at all. And the Ukrainian people have been promised a paradise of the West. Well, the West is a basket case itself.
Yeah, it still looks good here, though, Daniel. I mean, you live in Washington. I live in New York. We travel to San Francisco. We go to the bigger cities. I know the middle of our country is being hollowed out. The middle class is being destroyed. But nonetheless, there's still, at least in the money-centered banks around those places that really benefit from the printing of money, the Cantillon effect, as we've discussed on the show, are still doing pretty good. And the media, of course, the mainstream media makes it look as if things are just pretty good. But yeah, things are not good here either. We know that. And the direction of things, I keep telling people who tell me, Jay, you're complaining too much about America. We still have the best nation in the world. That may be true. But what I see is the direction of things, Daniel. It's the direction of things. Our loss of freedom and liberty, and the way things are going. The direction is definitely not the right way to go. No doubt about that. One of the things Ron Paul is often criticized for is being an economic isolationist, or being an isolationist. I don't think they use the word economic isolationist because it would be a total falsehood. But Ron pointed out in his article that actually we could be helping people, and we could really criticize the real isolationists, which he says are the NGOs. And how does, maybe you'd care to share with our listeners how Ron suggests we could be a positive influence in the world in terms of not isolationism, but the opposite.
Sure. What Dr. Paul always says, it's the people in favor of sanctions and blockades and restricting the Americans' access to business opportunities overseas. Those are the real isolationists.
Mm-hmm.
The people calling for sanctions against Russia are isolationists. And the people who support sanctions against Cuba are isolationists. And Dr. Paul has always said he's the opposite of an isolationist.
Absolutely.
He wants Americans to have the opportunity to go overseas, whether it's for travel or study, or to pursue business opportunities. And he's so in favor of people having business ties overseas, because when countries are tied by business and commerce, they're far less likely to go to war. So it's a huge benefit to both peace and prosperity. So it really is the isolationists who try to call Dr. Paul an isolationist.
Yeah.
He wants to isolate the U.S. government from bothering people overseas, but that's a whole different thing.
Right. Right, indeed, and I have to ask you. It just came to my mind now. There's something. A lot of these so-called free trade deals initiatives, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership is something that Obama's been trying to push through, and it really would sort of isolate China, I think, from, and maybe Russia, and try to set up a strength with Japan and so forth. Are you familiar at all with that, and do you know what the progress of that is?
I've looked a little bit at it. I have not looked at it lately, so I'm not sure what the absolute latest is. But Dr. Paul has also been criticized for not going in for these big trade deals. But they're, as you know, Jay, better than anyone, they're not about free trade at all.
No.
They're about managed trade and picking winners and picking sectors to support and sectors to not support. So it really is managed trade that's masking as free trade.
Right.
So the ideal free trade agreement would be about 2 sentences long. Very simple.
Yeah, just let people be free to trade with one another. And that would work, I think, for a lot of people. It would, but it's when people try to get government to pass laws that give them the advantage over others and getting rid of competition, which is really, again, getting back to that nasty economic term, fascism. I think is what we have, economic fascism. Daniel, it's too bad. It's the way it is. Some people have observed that the countries we seem to label as rogue states are countries that have sort of suggested that maybe we shouldn't just use the dollar as our exclusive reserve currency. And those countries seem to come under the most pressure. And there is some talk, and one of the guests on my show, David Jensen, is talking about the petro-gold replacing the petrodollar. We're becoming more self-sufficient in the United States now to a great extent with fracking and so forth, at least in the short term. And there's some other things going on, and there is a sense, at least a suggestion among some people, that Russia and China may indeed look to link together, and especially if we keep pushing the way we are, if the United States keeps pushing and the Western world tries to encroach into more and more into Asia, there may be a cooperative move between Russia and China to create something called petro-gold. The Chinese are importing huge amounts of gold, and massive amounts of physical gold going into China now, more than is being produced annually from the mines. And both of those countries have not been reserved in their desire to replace the dollar, or at least to have some competition for the dollar globally in trade. Do you think there's something behind that may be something that is really a key to understanding the geopolitical alignments that are going on?
Well, I think there's certainly something to be considered. I think the Russians and Chinese would be extremely reluctant to take that step because it wouldn't necessarily be a huge dislocation for them economically. The problem is they've been hinting that if pushed into a corner, they'll explore it.
Right.
You see it almost every day. And, the U.S. government seems to have a tin ear when it comes to these things. They had been hinting, very strongly all along that, really Ukraine for them is a red line. Stop trying to put NATO on their borders. And the U.S. just simply didn't listen. It has no ability to self-reflect,
Yeah.
And so I think if the U.S. Continues to refuse to listen to these increasingly strongly worded warnings about abandoning the dollar, I think you could find, even though certainly they would suffer as well, at least at first, I think you could find an enormous paradigm shift in the world.
Well, it seems to me that it's like a cornered animal that might be peaceful unless you threaten its existence, and I think that truthfully, that's the way Putin views the world now. And there have been so many promises that we've made to the Russians. I think after they disarmed themselves, and we've the NATO has moved further than we promised them that we would move, I believe, and so it seems understandable to me that Putin and other rulers in that part of the world would are starting to become quite alarmed with the Anglo-American empire, I like to call it, or the United States and the Eurozone. Do you any thoughts about that? And we do need we're just about out of time, but any closing thoughts on that, Daniel?
Sure, no, I think you're right, and I think for all of whatever faults you may have, I mean, he is a politician, but I think Putin does tend to, seems to me at least, to tend to look at the world as a realist, and that I think makes him behave in a certain way. And unfortunately, the U.S. is run by idealists, and they don't seem to have a coherent view of what really is U.S. interest overseas. What does the U.S. want?
Mm-hmm.
We're applying all these sanctions to Russia. Thankfully, none of them serious enough to destroy the economy or to really seriously affect the economy. But I think the rest of the world is scratching their heads saying, well, what do you want and what's the end game of these, And so
Right.
I don't think the U.S. is not able to articulate any sort of coherent foreign policy, and that is inherently dangerous.
Yeah, probably because there's nobody really in control. There's just all these forces, economic forces, that are looking out after their self-interest, and maybe the president certainly doesn't have the final say. That's my view anyway. But,
sure, and don't forget the neocon is like a virus, and it's still infected the foreign policy establishment. They can't seem to jettison this group of people who are always wrong.
Mm-hmm.
They just will never shut up.
Yeah, well, I think it's very important for people to understand what is really going on, and I would again just urge our listeners to go to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. There's a lot of great articles there. As I'm looking at today, we're looking at war in Syria set to intensify. Go read that. Why might that be the case? We don't have time to ask Daniel about this, but Daniel, you write a lot of the things that are there. I see that Ann Williamson has an article there that is very good.
That's a great article.
KTO,
I really encourage everyone to read that. That's a fantastic article.
KTO, KOGO, the NATO Syndrome, the EU's Eastern Partnership Program, and the EAU. Ann Williamson is someone I've known for a number of years, a great lady, former Wall Street Journal reporter in the Soviet Union, has a knowledge of the Soviet of Russia and that part of the world as much as anybody I know, Daniel. And I know
Yes.
you revere her work and her courageous stand against the establishment in many ways too. I see Ron Paul, another article, A New Cold War, just so many things. McCain's 11-point plan for war, the bloodthirsty senator from Arizona is really wanting to get us into another war. I don't understand it. I guess he thought it was fun being tortured. I don't know. Anyway, whatever. The point is, there's just a lot of very important things to read at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. I want to thank you very much, Daniel, for being with me once again.
Thank you so much, Jay. It's great to be with you.
Always great, and we'll look to do it again next week.
Thanks.
Thank you.